I'm excited to be with you today talking about Lean and Agile. Today we're going to focus on Lean and Agile auditing specifically from the viewpoint of, hey, you've been seeing these terms all around. I don't know about you. Every time I turn around, I'm getting another email where it's like, Lean and Agile training, Lean and Agile auditing. So what does this really mean? And from a strategic viewpoint, what should I be thinking about if I want to introduce this in my department? So we will focus on 4 critical decisions that you should, in our view, think about before moving forward. We'll also look at some of the more pertinent IIA standards, because for those of you who are familiar with Agile, you know that its founders were looking to pare down documentation wherever possible, and we certainly have a lot of documentation in audit. So that's the scope of what we'll be looking at today. I thought it might be interesting to start off with a poll question. Again, no wrong answers, but how many of you are already using Lean and Agile in your department, or experimenting with it, or wondering what all this stuff means? So while you're putting in your answers, I just want to underscore what Lark was telling you. We published an article at the end of May through the KnowledgeLeader website, and that is a more tactically oriented take on Lean and Agile. Those are things to do. This is a little bit more strategic. So let's see what we've got here. Okay, so most of you are wondering, what does all this stuff mean? So let me start by saying Lean and Agile, we're not just talking about being skinny as in Lean and nimble as in Agile. Agile is actually about 15, 16 years old, started in the software space, and is a set of beliefs and principles that really drive the outlook on software development. So what we're effectively doing is we are going to model that imitation is the highest form of flattery line by taking a look at what is the Agile approach as is used in software development, and how can we really apply this now to internal audit. So about 15, 16 years ago, some key developers got together, and I guess over some drinks and skiing, and I guess a fun time in general, they really wanted to get away from the traditional waterfall systems development lifecycle approach to software development, because they felt that it was inherently too documentation heavy and it took just way too long to provide something of value to the end user. So at the end of their weekend away, they had come up with 4 values that drive an Agile approach. And as you can see on your screen, the idea is we really want to focus on results. I'm kind of summing it all up if you look at the 4 values. The other piece that I think characterizes the 4 values, is thematically a focus on the customer. The idea of customer collaboration, being responsive to the business's needs or the user's needs, and really producing things that work within a short amount of time, or not necessarily taking months and months and months, but producing things literally in less than 30 days. So there's 12 principles to Agile. So I think for those of you who are new to this concept right out of the gate, I think you can see there's a little bit more to it than just being nimble. These principles, if you notice the first one, satisfying the customer, really being able to produce something of value, basically being nose to nose, communicating. If you notice value number 6, the most efficient and effective method is face-to-face conversation. So, I mean, all of this IMing and all of this email, if you stop and you think, well, gee, if I really want to adopt this, then we've got to get closer. We've got to be able to communicate more directly. The remaining principles, how do we evaluate success? Well, success is we've got something that is, ship ready or, useful. We can do something with it that we continue to advance what the user needs to get their work done. I would focus your attention on value principle 10, the idea of simplicity. Maximizing the amount of work not done. This is really getting at how much documentation do we need to prepare to really make our point. And I'd also focus your attention on the 12th principle. The team reflects on how to be more effective. I'm highlighting some of these principles because I think they most directly impact some decisions that we need to make in audit. You may have heard the term Scrum as used in Agile software development. And if you happen to be a rugby fan, the whole idea of a scrimmage or, the activity that occurs between both teams when a ball is put into play, that's the derivation of the term Scrum. But what it means in Agile auditing is it is the fundamental way that the teams work, communicate, set their priorities, and get their work done. The diagram that I've included is a high-level view of how a Scrum works. So let's marry up a couple of things. Customer focus, producing useful results in a short amount of time, and when I say useful to the customer. So the Scrum is comprised of 3 roles. You've got a product or process owner, that would be your customer. You've got a Scrum Master, who I would analogize as your in-charge auditor, your audit director or manager, and then you've got the team. Again, drawing the analogy back to audit, these would be your auditors. The product or process owner is the representative for your customer, meaning they understand the customer needs. They are the decision maker on behalf of the customer. They know what the customer needs. I should have mentioned also that this Agile approach was really born more in a manufacturing environment. So for those of you who are in higher ed or those of you who are in financial services where we've got intangibles, where we really don't have an inventory, we've got to stretch our minds a little bit in terms of how we make this fit in our world. But the idea is that the process or product owner and the Scrum agree on what the priorities are and what the team is going to work on and produce within a 30-day period. And then everybody just focuses on that. There are daily meetings with the Scrum members. There's stand-up, quote-unquote, stand-up meetings, typically lasting about 15 minutes long. And what I want to stress is that the customer representative is part of the meetings, so that you've got this nimbleness happening because of this frequency in communication. And then once the objective of the Scrum is completed, meaning we've got some work-ready product, we move on to the next thing in the backlog list. So that's pretty much a summary of Agile, given that we have an hour to talk about Agile and Lean, giving you an overview there. Lean basically has its roots in total quality management. It, again, like Agile, is defining value through the eyes of the customer, but Lean is really focused on eliminating waste and continual improvement. So when we start thinking about waste, there's some typical types or categories of waste, and I would urge you to start thinking about the types of waste that exist in your audit methodology, your internal audit methodology. Is it that you spend time waiting, for instance, waiting for documentation from clients? Are you waiting to get feedback or review notes on your draft audit reports? I think it's interesting that Lean categorizes motion, like are we spending too much time walking around? and we could cut back on some of that? Are we doing too much processing where we could do less and still be fine? So here's the second poll question. Again, more trying to get a sense of what's important to you, but what type of waste is most prevalent in your audit department? Is it rework? Is it wasted time? Is it having to reschedule meetings, when really we should have just been done in one? Or is it a lot of rework and multiple rounds of editing? And Lark, I just was going to pause here in case there's anything else we should be talking about.
Yeah, a great question came in. It's actually what you and I were talking about during the prep session. I think it'd be a good one to start off with. This person says, comparing this concept with SDLC or the software development lifecycle, the IT industry is facing a huge problem caused by the lack of security and documentation to give agility and rapid response to this process. How do you avoid the same issue with agile auditing?
I think that when we define what quality is, we need to include managing some of the core risks in the development process and make them part of what good looks like. So we isolate what those are, we articulate what they are, and they become the minimum standards for the documentation. That's a short answer to the question. But, I don't think the answer is no documentation. By the same token, I don't think it's writing, Tolstoy's War and Peace, tomes and tomes. But if we can agree on what we need to cover and make that risk focused, I think we'll be in good shape. So it's interesting to see we've got almost things that two areas tied, waiting for audit T documentation, which could really slow down the beginning of the audit, and then rework in multiple rounds before the report could be issued. So if I were in your shoes, I would say to myself, these might be one of the two areas that I might want to be a little bit more lean in, and you might want to take a look at the article for some ideas in specifically dealing with those areas. So at this stage in this webinar, I've kind of outlined the basics, again, high-level summary. I want to focus on the questions that you need to answer. And really talking about the first one that I think is pivotal. Who is your customer? Because that's going to drive what good looks like. That's going to drive value creation. And I think in audit, it's a little bit more challenging than it is in IT software development. So right on the heels of the last poll question, here's another one. In your department, who do you define as the department's primary customer? Is it the audit committee of the board, the C-suite, the process owner, the risk owner, the regulators, or someone else? And by the way, you might need to use the bar to scroll down so that you can hit the submit button, because I gave you quite a few choices. And I gave you quite a few choices because I think the reality is in the internal audit profession, we are serving more than one master, and it is a hierarchy. So I was going to pause again while people are punching in their answers. And let's see what people came up with. So overwhelmingly, we're defining the audit committee of the board as the primary customer. What I think is interesting is what came in the second position. The process owner out-edged the C-suite. Now, we have organizations of various sizes participating in this webinar. So it's possible that depending on your organizational structure, your process owners might also be members of the C-suite. If you're in some of the larger organizations where you've got like all this roll-up reporting or matrix reporting, that's what might be making a difference there between those two responses. But I do think that you and your audit management team has got to land on who is our primary customer. Because when we have to define what quality looks like, in Agile it's really easy. It's the user, and it's the user's representative that is that product owner or process owner calling the shots. Well, clearly in our organizations, we sometimes can't let management call those shots without escalating it to the board, because their appetite for risk might be more than the entire organization is willing to take on. So first critical decision, figure out who your customer is and really communicate that. Second critical decision, how are you going to handle the concept of self-organizing teams in internal audit, which is fundamentally a hierarchical profession? When you think about internal auditing and you think about documentation, it's usually saying use Auditor Judgement. You think about traditional audit teams. The driver of the team, the audit director or audit manager, typically has more experience than the staff who are doing the audits. So kind of thinking about that and saying, gee, how are we going to make that work for us? If you think about traditional audit teams, even those of you who are in smaller organizations where it might be one auditor assigned to the review, you still have the concept of one preparer and a reviewer. And embedded in traditional audit teams, you have the concept of the reviewers' say outweighs the preparers' say. Typically the lead has more experience than the people doing the work. The point that I really want to stress is the last point that you're viewing on the slide. The leadership style may be participatory in a traditional team, meaning I'm the lead auditor, I want to know what you think. We might reach agreement mutually on the assignments, but fundamentally, this is not a self-organizing team. And when we start looking at the Scrums in Agile, these teams have a couple of major differences. And hang on to your seats for the first one. The representative of the client is present on a daily basis, accessible on a daily basis, making decisions in a real-time way. Now, you stop and think about that. Think about the last time an auditee said, yeah, I'm ready to meet with you anytime, any place, every day, all the time. I mean, it's just unrealistic. They might be highly engaged, but the frequency with which you're talking to these folks might be once a week or on an ad hoc basis. When you actually look at the Scrum Master's role in Agile, the Scrum Master's primary role is to remove obstacles that are getting in the way of the team's performance. So if you can imagine these daily meetings to check status, 15-minute meetings, what did you do yesterday? What are you going to do today? What obstacles are going to get in the way of you doing what you need to do? Scrum Master is making a note of the obstacles and then circling back later on to figure out how to get rid of them, how to move them out of the way. Now, I'm not saying that in-charges are not doing that, but the rest of the team is very self-directed. So they're jumping in as needed, reprioritizing as needed to get the work done. So it's very flexible, self-organizing team formation. Typically not what you've got in a traditional audit team, again, assuming that you're in a department that's large enough for you to work on an audit with other auditors. So I am just going to slide over, but I thought before I move into the third decision, which is about documentation, just thought I would pause in case there's any comments or questions, Lark, that we should be dealing with at this point.
I think one of these questions is, it kind of gets down to the basics of, how is this approach different than a normal audit approach?
Well, that's what I think you've got to decide. I mean, that's why I'm raising these questions. What I'm getting at is if you decide that you want to adopt agile auditing, well, one of the things is we need to create things of value within a 30-day cycle. Now, stop and think about how long it takes you to complete your audits today. I mean, are you getting through them in 3 months? You're getting through them in 4 months? You're getting through them in 6 months? Right out of the gate, that's antithetical to being agile. You know, how much documentation are you creating? And that's the next thing I'm going to talk about. And how useful is that documentation? If you want to be agile, you're only going to create the minimum documentation that you need to get the job done. The focus is very much on useful results. So it's more of it's the way I'm looking at it, you look at the philosophies of, and I'm just talking about agile now, I'll circle back to talk about lean in a second, but you think about the philosophies that drive agile auditing, and you say to yourself, how many of these philosophies can we adopt and let drive our work and drive how we structure ourselves? So that's really my intent in sharing these questions, is to help people decide how you want to make these things work. I think on a modest level, you can make some behavioral change. For example, going now to the lean side of things, where can we eliminate waste? Well, we know, just based on the responses from this group today, that we've got 2 areas of waste that the participants are facing. One is in getting faster documentation from the auditees, and the second is decreasing the cycle time for report issuance. Well, what can we do within our shops? First of all, the report issuance one, yes, there's a component of that requires management corrective actions, but how much of that delay in report issuance is within the audit team itself? Back and forth and back and forth. We put the comma in, we take the comma out. Where can we introduce templates? Where can we introduce mapping of messages to accelerate the report issuance process? That was kind of a long answer to a short question, huh? But I think there's decisions that you need to make, and focusing on the documentation one, with this one, what I thought was interesting, and I hope you'll find it interesting too, we looked at some of the standards that specifically affect the audit methodology. So this one, Standard 2201, planning considerations. So in this standard, we're laying out what the auditors need to consider. But if you notice, as we're talking about considerations, it doesn't implicitly say anything about documentation. Now, those of you who are participating and who participated in other webinars that I've done, you know that I am a huge proponent of planning memos. But when we're putting our planning memos together, are all of the fields that we're putting in our planning memo, are they all useful? Are they all helping us? Or are they just creating some delay or some waste? Now, when you look at the engagement objective standard for the assurance reviews, implied in this, it's saying objectives must be established. But here again, it's not saying, and you need to document it in a 22-page document. So where are we during the planning stage documenting more perhaps than we need to? When you look at, again, staying with planning, and you look at Standard 2240, which keys to the work program, again here, implied, it's written. It's in some form. But it doesn't go into any detail on how much documentation. So I think we've got opportunities to take a hard look at our methodologies and ask the tough question, what's adding no value here? What could we delete, simplify, and still have integrity and meet the reperformance standard in our planning efforts? Because you know as well as I do, every work paper that you create is a work paper that needs to be reviewed. Some thoughts, going back, Lark, to the question about, how can we apply this information? This is actually more from a lean auditing, waste management, where waste elimination these would be some of the questions that I would be taking back to my team. At what point is the planning documentation really fit for purpose? If you're not familiar with the expression fit for purpose, meaning we can go with it. Is it perfect? No, but it works. It's literally fit for the purpose for which it was created. Is every field in our planning memo relevant? Is every field in our risk and control evaluation relevant? I've looked at some risk and control matrices, and, my God, they've got like 40 columns. Oh, my goodness. It's a lot. Now, I'm not saying that one column is enough, but certainly we've got to find, some way in between and ask those tough questions. Is there anything that's redundant or that could be combined, if not in point of fact, outright, eliminated? The last question, in our planning documentation, are we starting planning with the report in mind? What things are we writing during the planning phase that we could map to our report and accelerate the reporting process? These would be some of the things that I think we should focus on. I'm going to move away from planning. I wanted to highlight some of the standards in testing that I thought key to documentation. And as I go through these standards, think about how much are we writing in the testing phase. What could we eliminate or streamline in the testing phase that would accelerate the audits and enable us to get to end of job faster, produce something of value. So we're on the hook to identify, analyze, evaluate, and document, emphasis mine on document, sufficient information. So I'm sure we've all seen sufficient. And I think it's interesting to focus on the definition of sufficient information, reliable information, and that's why I included Standard 2310. It's factual, adequate, convincing. The idea that it's relevant, it supports the observations. But notice it doesn't say we need 30 pages of it. So I think taking a critical look at what we are already documenting, and is it helping us or is it hurting us? By the way, for those of you in smaller shops, you might not have any templates to follow. Each auditor might be on his or her own, and that might be something that you end up changing to create a structure, because when there's no structure, people can waste time trying to figure out what they need to write, and that can be a sinkhole for time that you'll never get back. So finding that balance from a lean viewpoint, again, eliminating waste, what documentation requirements are inconsistent? Are there any that are so duplicative it's not funny? Are you asking auditors to do some activities that if they were eliminated, no one would mind? No one would even notice. Is there anything that we can accelerate instead of having to write things out? Just have a check or have a yes or have a no. Is there anything that we can do to leverage software so that we can get a better bang for our buck during testing? So once again, Lork, before I go forward, I thought I would just pause to see if there were any things that we should be talking about.
Yeah, this one relates to the concept of a one-person team, and this person wanted to know would this concept work for an audit team of one?
So if I were an audit team or an audit department, if I were an audit department of one, I think I'd be thinking about how I personally could manage my time and be efficient. If I were an audit team of one, there are certain things we know we're going to have to do and I would be looking to see if we could get some common approaches so that when you're a team of one, I don't think you think about the time that goes into review because you're usually not the one doing the review. And so I think the benefit when you're a team of one, again, smaller department, is to have some core fundamental templates that are used at each juncture in the audit, annotated templates, so that everyone knows how much writing and what type of writing goes where and why. And that way you'll end up saving time. You'll be leaner on the review side because review time gets charged to the audit as well. And when I say charged to the audit, even if you're not officially tracking time, you can't release an audit report until everything's been reviewed. Or I should say you shouldn't be releasing an audit report unless everything's been reviewed. So even if you're a team of one, I think you can benefit by introducing some consistency to the methodology. I have a poll question because I'd like you to think about your documentation requirements in your department. Get a feel for, think about what you have to document for planning, what you have to document for testing, and what you have to document for reporting. And what do you think? We're now looking for opportunities where we can introduce lean or agile techniques into your methodology. Is it too much, just the right amount, too little, or is it just inconsistent? Everyone's doing it a slightly different way, which also has ramifications for waste. Lark, anything else we should be talking about?
Yeah, it's so hard to choose. There's so many good questions coming in. And this one is probably more focused on industries that are regulated, but this person wanted to know what reactions have been observed from regulators who are evaluating this type of audit approach.
I don't know that it's been called out as much to the regulators. So I'm really not sure. This lean and agile auditing seems to be just gaining some steam. When I say gaining some steam, meaning some of the larger shops are piloting different audits. And given that the typical audit cycle takes, 3-4 months, optimistically, how many pilots can you get through in a year? 3, 4? So I think the jury is still out on that. But again, going back to my comment earlier about related to the SDLC, the Systems Development Lifecycle, and documentation, we're not saying no documentation. We're not saying let's throw out the reperformance standard, let's throw out the standard on standalone work papers. What I'm saying is let's be intelligent about it. Let's look for opportunities to objectively eliminate things that are not creating value, which takes me back to defining your customer. So if your customer is the board, when you define what's not creating value, the answer to the first question, okay, at the board level, ultimately that's our ultimate customer. That's going to drive different decisions about how you implement lean and agile in your department. I'm curious to see what people said. So most people, this is interesting, 1/3 of the people feel that they've got just the right amount of documentation. So if I felt that I had just the right amount of documentation, then my challenge would be to look elsewhere to become more lean and more agile. Because if you feel that you have the right amount of documentation, then let's look at some other things that might be contributing to slowing the process down or creating some extra work there. I'm sorry, I'm also thinking about correlating this answer to the answer about where we've got waste, and that was in the planning and in the reporting. So if the documentation is just the right amount for planning and reporting, then it's other things in those sub-processes that are slowing us down. And then there's another third who feel like, hey, we've got redundancies. So that's almost easier to address and be lean and agile with that, because figure out, where those redundancies are. And it's also interesting that, 26% feel it's inconsistent. Well, the minute it's inconsistent, I think you have probably the greatest opportunity to introduce lean and agile and really see a market difference in your department's performance. The last area in standards that I wanted to go through was the report itself, because I really find when you look at these standards, it's not really talking about how you put the report together. So now, when I look at an audit report, I see it, and some of you know this, I see it as a reflection of the head auditor's relationship with the constituents within the organization. Who is the report being tailored to? Is it the process owner? Is it the area that's being audited? Is it the C-suite? Who's the target? But looking at this report format and the standard and saying, hey, how much are we writing? How much do we really need to write in terms of the report? We have one client that looking at the criteria for communication, internal auditors are encouraged to acknowledge satisfactory performance, encourage my emphasis. And their report cites the results of all the testing that they did, when the results are positive and when the results are not. So right out of the gate in that culture, they're reporting on more, possibly, than is required by the standard. You look at the standard on disseminating results. This is the chief audit executive is responsible for communicating the final results, but it really doesn't say what the form needs to be. It doesn't stipulate that it needs to be in a report that has an executive summary. It doesn't stipulate the layout at all. So this might be another opportunity to be a little bit more lean and agile, even in terms of the components of the report. The interpretation in the next standard, I think, keys to minimum requirements in terms of the communication. So if you focus your attention to the box that's on your screen, here we're talking about, well, what are the elements of an overall opinion that need to be communicated? But again, how it's communicated is not something that the standards speak to. So one opportunity might be to take a look at your report format. In what ways can we streamline it, make it more simple? In what ways can we map data from the test work papers into observation forms, and from there into a report format? Monitoring, I included this standard because this is the follow-up that we do, that we're required to do, but it doesn't get into how, what kind of a process. So there might be opportunities to streamline your follow-up auditing process and save some time. The final standard that I wanted to bring up for consideration was Standard 2600, communicating the acceptance of risk. And here again, it's more focused on the oral in terms of communication, not necessarily saying anything about actually writing something. So if we want to be lean and agile in auditing, particularly in the reporting phase, I've included these questions to get you thinking about some opportunities where you might be able to streamline. And I mentioned earlier, beginning the planning with the report in mind, getting everyone to write in a report-worthy way. And I want to pause at this point. When I say report-worthy, I think it's important to know who you're writing to. So really defining the profile of the primary audience for the audit report. You know, we talked about this a little bit earlier as well. Where are your time-wasting steps in the report compilation process? And, you know, it might be in the editing that occurs between the in-charge, the manager, and the staff. You know, I do know that sometimes the editing can go back and forth so much so as to make the fundamental issue or the original issue unrecognizable to the staff member who found it. And I think the more I look at that area, I think it's more, gee, have we landed on the root cause? And do we have a format for how we want to think about these issues and then write about them? The third point here, have we identified our customers' reporting needs? This might sound so obvious, but I cannot tell you how many times I've asked the question, well, what do your customers think of your report? What do your constituents think of your report? What does the end user think of it? Well, they don't really say anything. Well, have you asked? Well, not really. You know, sometimes I guess we think no news is good news. But it might be an interesting starting point to find out, well, what parts of your report do they really like? What do they want to see more of? What parts of your report are they not looking at all or hardly looking at? And getting a feel for that. I think the last question, how do you know that you're meeting your customers' informational needs, is really a critical one. Because if we go back to the philosophies around agile development, it's about really working in close proximity, a close collaboration with the customer to meet their needs. So that might be the starting point for making your reporting process a little bit more lean. I'd like you to think about your department's report issuance process. Here's another poll slide. You know, which of these statements best describes your department? You know, we have a defined, repeatable, and reliable way to assess and satisfy our customers' informational needs. We have an informal process to determine whether our reports are meeting the customer's needs. Since the report is audits product and contains our message, you know, we're determining the report layout, or I'm not sure. Defining any part of the audit methodology is above my pay grade. And Lark, while they're responding, is there anything that we should talk about?
Yeah, a very interesting question came in on another hot topic, and it's how does data analytics play into helping an audit shop take a more agile approach?
If you think about how, in the absence of analytics, if you think about how we do our work, it's largely manual. We talk to people, we look around, we pick a sample of items. They might be processing 1 million, and we'll pick 25 or 30, and we'll look at them. And we're basing our opinion on the controls, operating effectiveness on this manually chosen set of items. When you pause and you just reflect on that, you think, wow, a couple of things at least hit my mind. Wouldn't it be great if we could minimize our audit risk by optimizing our coverage? And once we get past the original bump in the road, which is developing the filter and building that competency to develop queries, we could then have the ability to look at 100% of the transactions, again, assuming the data is available electronically. I think that's a benefit. From the customer's viewpoint, you know, when you are able to compare two data stores electronically and point out differences to them, and they're like, how did you do that? And you're able to say, hey, We used this filter, or we used this, we used this formula. We used this approach. We used this query. We can join these tables, whatever the heck you did. That's exciting. And then they say, can we have a copy of that? We'd like to build that in to our daily work. I think that's a win all the way around. The third way I think analytics is a win is from a staff retention perspective. Most people today view themselves, myself included, as a product. We have to stay marketable. We have to continue to add value. Otherwise, we become obsolete. Well, learning new skills is a way of keeping one's market value up. Learning, it's just simple. Learning is a way of keeping one's market value up. So when we look at analytics, I think it has benefits all the way around. If we are able to use software in the beginning of an audit to do some, what I affectionately call slicing and dicing, some of the mining to get a better sense of the transactions in the population, the outliers, I think that gives us a different dimension of understanding concerning the areas we're going to audit. One of the biggest obstacles in auditing is not understanding the process under review, not understanding what's really going on there. Can you audit an area and not understand it? Oh, it happens all the time. I'm not saying that that's the way, the way it should be happening, but, I'm just a practical person. So I think analytics has a big role to play, especially as we're moving more and more towards mobile technology, more and more things in a cloud, more and more things that are electronic, less, and less paper. And once again, a long answer to a short question. Sorry about that. This is an interesting response. It's almost even. It's really almost even, with a third feeling that they have a defined, repeatable, reliable process. So that response, once again, I think we have to kind of juxtapose that to maybe these aren't the folks that have the delay in the reporting. Where it's informal, the 25% of the folks that have an informal process, you probably have the greatest opportunity to apply lean techniques. And I'm especially emphasizing lean because it's more of the waste management techniques to your methodology. With the folks, the third that are talking about, we determine the report layout. Now, from an agile philosophical viewpoint, that's not so customer focused the way I wrote the statement. And if we look at it again with an agile philosophical approach, hey, we're looking to move the organization forward. So I think that's kind of interesting. So far we've looked at a couple of the decisions to think about. Who's your customer? How do we deal with self-organizing teams? How much documentation can we get rid of? And the fourth strategic decision that I think you have to make if you want to figure out how to be lean and agile in auditing is this, how can we add value quickly? Because in agile auditing, you're adding value. You're creating something that's quote-unquote ship-ready, good, fit for purpose within 30 days. So maybe what we need to start doing is thinking about our audit methodology in these little sprint runs, planning within a certain amount of time, testing within a certain amount of time, reporting within a certain amount of time, as a way of getting everyone focused on useful results within a short amount of time. Now, some forms currently of value-added auditing, like continuous monitoring or targeted audits, horizontal audits, integrated audits, some of the advisory services, some of the pre-implementation reviews, they're really adding value, but they might also take some time to do. So one more poll for you. Which best fits your department? Your department regularly engages in new assurance and advisory services. Your department doesn't have any resources to allocate to anything other than traditional assurance audits, or you're not sure, you don't know. And while they're putting in their answers, any questions that we should be talking about, Lark? Well, I seem to have lost my ability to hear Lark. So sorry.
Sorry about that. I was talking and
you were muted.
Sorry about that. I was muted.
It happens to all of us at one point or another. No worries.
So this comes back to a kind of a balancing act that audit is, constantly trying to figure out the answer to, about the balance between auditing and consulting activities, adding more value to the organization. Can this agile approach also be implemented into more consulting type of activities that audit is asked to do?
Yeah, I don't see why not. In fact, I could see agile being implemented into advisory services on two levels. One level being physician heal thyself, and making sure that the methodology that we're using for our advisory services, our consulting services, is nimble, is waste-free to the extent that it can be, is customer-focused, is focused on value creation. So that's the first way that I see we could apply the Agile values and philosophies to advisory work. And then the second is in the products that we are creating, the output that we are creating. Let's create a workflow or a solution that's agile for the customer to use, the end, whoever's contracting with us for these advisory services. Let's come up with something, and we're thinking about it, and let's make sure that it's easy to maintain. Let's make sure that it doesn't have any wasteful steps in it or any cumbersome controls in it. So I think there's two levels that we could use Agile in advisory services very, very easily. And so we've got almost 60% of the respondents, are doing both assurance and advisory services, and just about a third are just doing traditional assurance. My intent with this question is not to say, oh my goodness, how sad that all you can do is assurance work. That's not my intent at all. My intent was just to get a sense for what is your service line. But I certainly think that we could be lean and agile in assurance reviews or advisory services. So I'm looking at the time. I know we have time for a couple more questions, hopefully. But I wanted to tie all of this together. When we started this webinar, it was really to focus your attention on some strategic decisions that I think you should make before you go whole hog and try to be lean and agile. And when I say whole hog, I am thinking about it from a department-wide perspective. Certainly on an individual level, you could eliminate waste in your own work life. Certainly you could be lean in how you approach your projects. But I'm thinking more department-wide. How do we add value? And so I wanted to tie everything together by saying, get rid of anything that's not useful, beautiful, or joyful. And I thought, I guess we have time for a couple more questions. What are you thinking, Lark?
Yeah, I think we can get through probably one. And this one is more on a resource topic, and this person's asking, is it best to hire someone into an audit practice that comes with this type of mentality or philosophy to implement this? Or can it be done by a traditional auditor?
Well, is the question someone who's done it before or someone who just has this openness, receptivity to it?
I would say experience. Yeah, so it'd be someone who's possibly done this before, maybe even in a software environment?
I think that I think certainly you could do this on your own. I think that you could look at and talk to people in your network and network with organizations who are currently experimenting with adapting lean and agile techniques in their audit department. So, for example, in the article that I wrote that was released on May 29th, we talk about burn down charts and using them as a way to plot progress. Now, you don't have to go whole hog and implement Agile. You could still do that to see the velocity with which the team is approaching and completing its deliverables. Now, if you're saying to yourself, oh, wow, well, then that means I have to research what they look like, it might be faster for you to hire somebody who's been in the shop that has done this. But keep in mind that if you bring somebody in who's not familiar with audit at all, do be prepared to have to give them a crash course in some of the core concepts like professional skepticism, the concept of preparer-reviewer, standalone, work papers. So you can implement in a variety of ways. I think the bigger issue, though, is what's the tone at the top of the house? Because even if you hire somebody with experience, if the tone at the top is resistant, it's going to be a problem. Just realized we're at the top of the hour, a little beyond.
We are. Thank you for presenting today.
My pleasure. Look forward to the next one.